Viewers, as part of Times Now's post-corona scenario series, we will be speaking to globally acclaimed strategy advisor Dr. Parag Khanna on examining the global outcomes of the coronavirus. Dr. Khanna, thank you for joining me. We've had the occasion of course, meeting earlier on the sidelines of a summit in Mumbai, which we organize every year. But apart from that, we're also going to speak here about projecting into the future a little bit. And I want to ask you, after the Second World War, the world irrevocably changed. Several institutions came up to deal with the prospect of an unrecognizably new dispensation. And we saw the birth or the strengthening, really, of the United Nations framework, of human rights bodies like the ICJ, etc. This particular episode, these times that we are going through, are no more disruptive than the effect of the Second World War. What do you see emerging from the ruins of the coronavirus outbreak?
It's very good to see you, Rahul. Thanks so much for having me on the program. And I think you've started with a very important question. Do we need to build entirely new institutions right now to cope with this calamitous situation that we're in, an economic crisis of a far greater scale than the financial crisis of 10 years ago? And remarkably, let's remember that one set of institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which we, particularly here in Asia, have been very critical of in recent decades, they have, at least at the moment, risen to the occasion. We're seeing that 100 countries are drawing on their credit line from the International Monetary Fund. $1 trillion of emergency lending is going to be provided. The World Bank is working to provide $160 billion of emergency lending to governments around the world. Together, they have lobbied very heavily and successfully for all debt for low-income countries, principal and interest, to be suspended for the remainder of this year. So the economic institutions have come together remarkably well. Other bodies, obviously, like the World Health Organization, have come under very severe criticism. We knew the World Health Organization was weak from the time of its handling of the Ebola outbreak 5 or 6 years ago. Clearly, the over-politicization, over-bureaucratization of it has brought it into an almost sort of terminal state of disrepair at this point in time. The lesson, Rahul, is that there's many different institutions, actually, of global governance. The United Nations Security Council, which, of course, India and other countries have sought to have permanent membership in over the last several years, is not front and center in an issue like the coronavirus. So of the 250 international organizations that we have, some still matter a lot, like the IMF, others are failing, and some don't matter at all. And in each crisis like this, we have to really focus on those that are going to be helpful at a global level.
Well, there are several different transformations that are very clearly now visible. And one of them is the focus, the renewed focus on what many people are saying is the supply chain model that has been feeding economies, especially the developed economies and the Asian tiger economies, the origins of which, of course, lie in China. Are we going to see a shift away as countries build redundancies? I mean, obviously, a large number of big countries, the businesses in those countries have realized that you cannot have a supply chain model that is leveraged really on one country.
Absolutely. And as you know, Rahul, I've been saying for many years that when it comes to global supply chains, diversity is the ultimate path to resilience. And of course, many, many companies have done the opposite. They have had all of their eggs in the China basket. Let's remember, though, that diversion away from China, that awakening that we should not be too dependent on China, began 10 years ago. It's just that it's a slow process. Japan began to significantly shift its investments out of China 10 years ago. And you probably remember why. It was when China threatened to ban the export of those precious rare earth metals and elements that are used in electronics and other materials. We threatened to block the export of those to Japan. And Japan said, you know what, we can't risk being too over concentrated or dependent on China. And in any case, China's wages were rising. So Japan led the way in shifting supply chains away from China. And the biggest winner of that was Southeast Asia, right? Was Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia. These countries have been attracting ever more of that low wage labor. Now, not only will there be a more regional diversification, distribution of those supply chains, but as you also mentioned, there will be more near shoring. But remember that this also began before the pandemic. Because of the US China trade war, 1 year ago, United States trade with Canada was $330 billion. American trade with Mexico was more than $300 billion. And American trade with China was only $270 billion. So North American countries trade more with each other already than with China. And that's because of the trade war, not the coronavirus. And in Asia, China trades more with Southeast Asia than it does with the United States. So the bottom line, Rahul, is that we are moving towards a tripolar system. There's a North American system, there's a European system, and there's an Asian system. But let's remember, our Asian system here is much bigger than the others demographically. It's 50% of the global economy in purchasing power parity terms. And it's not just one power, right? It's China, it's India, it's Japan, it's also Korea and Australia. It is a much more diffuse, complex, and multipolar region than any other part of the world. And it also has, of course, because of the large population and underdevelopment, huge potential to grow. A couple of billion people who are still not connected to infrastructure, financial markets, supply chains, and so forth. So coming out of this crisis, when we look at the economy, we have to say to ourselves, how quickly do you expect North America to recover with 25, 30 million people unemployed and the economy contracting and the deficits going through the roof? How fast do you expect Europe to recover, which was already growing so slowly and cannot issue these coronavirus bonds to socialize their debt and to help the southern European countries? Not very optimistic. In Asia, there is a lot of suffering right now. Poverty alleviation is slowing down. The lockdown obviously is having a very, very painful impact on many, many hundreds of millions of people. But do we have the capacity, the willpower, the strong governments, the pro-poor and people-centric policies in this region to help Asia recover faster than other parts of the world? I absolutely think so.
Well, very interesting that you should be making these points, but look, there are certain inescapable conclusions that are appearing. Just today, India has decided to take a slightly more adventurous step forward. Of course, it's well calibrated because we know that the lockdown itself, this sort of total 100% lockdown is going to debilitate the economy. But having done so, we're also aware that the virus might return, maybe 3 months down the line, 4 months down the line. Many people are already talking about the W curve. So how does one deal with and I have to use this word, an abstract threat like this that you cannot really game for in any particular scenario? How does one prepare?
As we know, and the medical experts are right when they say testing, 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 right? Now, obviously, India has a certain advantage in that a large amount or share of the generic drug market is centered on India. There is a strong possibility that India's, say, homegrown, if you will, remedies are going to be very useful. So on the remedy side, it is possible that India is going to be able to cope well. But of course, we need a lot more testing. We need to be better at social distancing, all of these kinds of things. But I do think that technology is a very important part of the solution, as it is whether it is a country with a high density and poor population, or even a high density and wealthy population like Singapore, where I live right now. Everything will change here, even when the number of infections drops to zero. because there is going to be this abundance of caution, because it is an open economy. People are coming from all over the world all the time. Actually, there's 15 to 20 million visitors just to tiny Singapore every single year, which is actually more than India receives every year. So there's a domestic strategy and international strategy. But there's no doubt, Rahul, that there has to be a focus now on improving the healthcare system, improving the medical system. We have now divided our economies into essential services and non-essential services. And I think that this is almost a moral calling, Rahul, that we provide more resources, more investment, more fiscal support to those things that are truly essential. And India, like many, many countries in the world, most certainly the United States, as we can see in the news every day, has not accorded enough resources to what is truly essential.
But it's very interesting because for the first time, perhaps, there will be pressures after the Second World War to look within, to dismantle the global architecture that relies on free trade, free borders, etc. Because we've seen corona spread from one country to the other unsparingly. Do you believe that the project of globalization will be stressed in the near term?
The truth is it's a mixed picture. We are looking right now at a world where some dimensions of globalization have ground to an absolute halt, migration being one of them. We have zero migration right now. Perhaps never have we run such a controlled experiment on mankind, closing all borders simultaneously. It is absolutely remarkable. But moving forward, you can imagine that many people will be saying, I have just lived through quarantine in a red zone, in a country with a horrible capacity in the medical system, no testing, no surgical masks, and the minute borders are open, I will take my savings and leave this country. Imagine Iran, to take an obvious example, right? And many, many other countries right now. So you will see people moving again. Now, trade. It is the globalization project, as you call it. The purpose of globalization is not for everything to distribute towards these fragile, just-in-time, far-flung, environmentally ruinous supply chains. That's not the highest calling. It's not the optimal. The optimal is actually to do locally what you can do locally. That's, in fact, much better for the environment. Why should fuel have to be put on tankers and sent from Norway or Kuwait to India when you could have biomass power, nuclear power, wind power, solar power, right? So you could have de-globalization of hydrocarbon energy. That would be a wonderful thing, right? And now let's not forget finance. Trade is billions. Finance is trillions, Rahul. And our capital markets in Asia are opening. China is liberalizing its capital accounts. India wants to do the same. We in our economies want to draw in trillions of dollars of savings, institutional investors, pension funds, private wealth into our economies. That is globalization, and that globalization is surging ahead. Digital globalization. The Economist had a story titled, "The Internet is bursting at the seams." Digital globalization is as valuable as all of the goods that are put on ships and sailed around the world, and it's becoming unquantifiably important. That is globalization too. So quite frankly, I have very little concern that globalization will flourish in many, many different ways. Let's focus on how each country can make the most of it.
Okay, well, I totally agree with you, because some of the challenges that are facing us will only be defeated by coming together as a community of nations. What do we have staring at us? The worst amongst them, the most incipient amongst them, is global warming, climate change. So that cannot be fought by one country alone. So you will have to come together. But finally, Dr. Khanna, I want to ask you this question. It's an important one. How does India make the most out of a situation where perhaps some of the developed economies in the world are thinking or rethinking these stretched supply chains that they have sort of, realized have turned into nooses? Can India become that source of local production?
I think we know the answer to that. And fortunately, unlike many, many other countries where the answer is no, in India, the answer is yes. India has human capital. India has industrial potential. India has raw materials. India has financial capability and capital, and India has technology, India has know-how. These are the 5 or 6 fundamental building blocks of greater self-sufficiency. India does not need to import as many raw materials as it does. It can be much more independent in terms of renewable and alternative energy. India is obviously a net global software exporter. India can create far more jobs in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. India can already make and does make a lot more mobile phones, automobiles, and so forth, rail cars as well. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. And if this is the crisis that has been required to accelerate those efforts, so be it. Born out of tragedy, this can be a very important source of renewal. And let's remember that India is quite frankly blessed to have the potential to achieve these things out of this dire situation. So I urge policymakers, the business community, to make the most of it. It does require investing in ourselves as a country.
We leave it to that. Thank you, Dr. Khanna, for joining us on Times Now. We'll take a short break. Lots more coming up. Stay with us, viewers.